This time it's 5 classic big British thumpers. Oh, the big one long 4-stroke thumper. Is there any motorcycle that is more British than that? If there is, I don't know. And of course, over the years, most British companies did produce big single-cylinder thumpers. On this video we're just going to show 5 of them, but don't worry if your favourite big single isn't included this time. I'm sure we'll be getting round to making another video on these machines at a later date, and it may well be included then. Because when it comes to big singles and British bikes, there's a hell of a lot to choose from. But for a start, here's 5 classic big British thumpers. The AJW Flying Fox. Now it was in 1926 that one Arthur John Wheaton, who liked to be known as Jack, founded his own motorcycle company, in Exeter of all places. He called the company AJW after his initials. Now, like a lot of British companies at the time, AJW is very small, producing only around 250 machines a year. And this of course meant that they didn't build their own engines. Quite common engines they would use were Jap, as on this particular version, but also the Rudge Python, a customer version of their Ulster engine, was also used in some machines. Now, the engine on this particular model is of 500cc and of course overhead valve, so one of their more sporting machines. And the engine used is essentially one cylinder from their mighty V-twin motors, enclosed valve gear and all. And this of course means you can reasonably expect something over 20 horsepower from this motor for a top speed of around 80 to 85 miles an hour on a good day. And of course there's a 4-speed foot change gearbox, this being a sportier model. Of course trading conditions were very difficult for small companies in the immediate post-war period. There were no longer Python engines available, and Jap was all but out of business by that point too. They would nevertheless produce a small capacity engine with a Villiers 125 engine until 1953, and thereafter they would import Italian-made mopeds and small machines, and they would continue doing this until 1981. The matchless G80. Matchless had been founded by the Collier brothers in Plumstead in London in 1899 and had a long and very proud history of producing sporting single-cylinder machines. And in 1907 they'd won the first Isle of Man TT, at least the single-cylinder class, and actually the overall win too. Now, of course the design of the G80, by its appearance obviously, dates all the way back to the mid-30s, when the Sporting 500 had a rigid rear end and of course girder front forks. However, by the late 30s the company had designed its very own hydraulically damped telescopic forks, and the military version of the G3L would be very popular with dispatch riders during World War II. The first post-war models arrived in 1946 and were very similar to the military machines, retaining the telescopic fork and rigid rear end layout. However, this would all change in 1949 when the first models arrived with swinging arm rear suspension. The engine was of course a traditional overhead valve big British single of 498cc, that had a 4-speed gearbox and produced 28 horsepower at 5,600 rpm. The machine was a very fine big British single, but problematically would stay in production until 1966, by which time it was completely obsolete. Ariel's Red Hunter series. As a company, Ariel was founded way back in 1870 and was started by one James Starley, who had patented the spoked cycle wheel, and one William Hillman, who I believe is the guy who later set up a car company. In 1896 they took over Westwood Manufacturing. These had produced a powered tricycle which used a 2.25 horsepower de Dion Bouton engine, and from there it was a small step to producing their own motorcycles and cars. Hillman would soon leave and found Premier Motorcycles, and later moving into car manufacturing. Like so many companies, Ariel would hit financial trouble during the stock market crash of the late 20s and early 30s. The company would go bankrupt but would be bought out by Jack Sangster. Sangster would move and bring in Val Page as an engine designer, and he would design the engines which would form the basis for the Red Hunter series. However, it would be Edward Turner who, during his period at the company during the mid-30s, would christen the bikes the Red Hunter series. He would also bring in his fresh styling with chrome tanks and that beautiful red paint finish. However, by the end of the 30s, Velpage was back at the company and would redesign and develop the bikes throughout their history. This would include in 1939 the addition of anti-plunger rear suspension at the rear as an option, although by that point of course the company had been taken over by BSA. 1946 would see the advent of new models, now sporting telescopic forks in place of the old girders. The engine was a 497cc overhead valve big single of course, produced around 26 horsepower. The bore and stroke was 81 by 95mm and the compression ratio was 6.8 to 1. And transmission was a 4-speed gearbox built by Berman. Performance of the machine was fairly standard for the time, with a top speed of just over 80 miles an hour. It would go on to be very successful in off-roading, especially trials where Sammy Miller would continue to use the bike long after it had gone out of production, the last models being sold in 1959. Although production had actually been wound down at the end of 1957 to make way for Ariel's new 2-stroke range. Panther Model 100 and 120. Unlike so many British motorcycle manufacturers, Phelan and Moore, or P&M, the makers of Panther, were not based in the Midlands. They weren't even based in London. In fact, they were based in Cleckheaton in Yorkshire. And it was Phelan who, in the years before World War I, had come up with the idea of using the engine as a stressed member of the frame, with the cylinder and engine block effectively taking the place of the front down tube. A practice which is very common in motorcycles of the 1980s and even until today. They owe it all to P&M. Now the Model 100 was released all the way back in 1932 and unfortunately the company's struggles during that period and indeed into later periods would mean that the company was never really able to develop a modern replacement for the machine. The engine was of course an overhead valve single of a whopping 598cc with a bore and stroke of 87 by 100mm. The engine kicked out around 23 horsepower at a very lazy 5,300 rpm, enough for around 70 miles an hour. But the engine was very much a big old period piece, right down to the Egyptian style decoration on the side of the timing case. And the lubrication system relied very heavily on splash, with an oil tank being cast in at the front of the engine cases. Early 1932 models used P&M's own 4-speed gearbox. This would be replaced in 33 for 1 year only by Sterney Archer before they moved on to using Berman gearboxes in 1934. Post-war of course the machine would be little changed, save the addition of some very clever pneumatically damped front forks on early models. With its massively torquey engine it was very popular with sidecar riders, and that's why the engine was enlarged later to 650cc in the early 60s. But by that point it was obvious the machine was horribly outdated, and cheap cars were poaching into its sidecar market. Final production would end in 1966, with the Model 100 stopping in 1963. The Norton ES2. Norton was another company with a proud history of building big singles. Their overhead valve singles had formed the backbone of their racing and competition success during the 1920s, before being later replaced of course by the overhead cam models. And the Norton ES2 was very much a road-going development of their early competition overhead valve engines. Norton introduced the ES2 in 1927, and problematically the machine would stay in production pretty much with the same motor right the way through until 1964. The engine was the usual very traditional overhead valve British single, external pushrod tubes, iron head and barrel. It had a very long stroke with a bore and stroke of 79 by 100mm, and was pretty much the same as that fitted to the earlier Model 18, which dated all the way back to 1922. Although some improvements were made to the engine during its production run, with the final models making slightly more power than those produced earlier, at around 25 horsepower at 5,500 rpm, for top speed, given the 4-speed gearbox, of around 82 miles an hour. But really, even compared to other big British singles, this was an old-fashioned motor. The ES2 is definitely a bike where the chassis development outstripped that of its engine. Early models of course used girder front forks and had rigid rear ends. Post-war 1947 onwards bikes had telescopic forks and were even available with plunger rear suspension. and from 1953 onwards this would be superseded by a proper rear swinging arm suspension chassis. But even better things were to come, because in 1959 the machine was fitted with a Rex McCandless featherbed frame, giving it a suspension and chassis setup which was far beyond the performance of the engine. Another change was the move over to an AMC gearbox and a Lucas alternator. The last ES2s from 61 onwards would gain the slimline frame, which was even better, in terms of rider comfort at least. 1964 would be the last year of the original ES2. It had been replaced the following year by a bike fitted with an AMC engine, although these later bikes are extremely rare today. BSA B33. Although perhaps not as glamorous as the Norton or even the Matchless, the BSA B33 is regarded as one of the very best of Britain's big singles. BSA's B33 first arrived just after World War II and was a development of the earlier 350 B31, although both these bikes owe a great deal to BSA's pre-war big singles. Early post-war models had telescopic forks but did have rigid rear ends. Plunging suspension would later be available as an option, but in 1954 the machine gained a proper swinging arm chassis. And make no mistake, BSA's chassis is a good one. Okay, it's not as good as a Norton featherbed, but it's pretty much on par with anything else on the market at the time. And that chassis was shared across the range from 54 onwards, whether they be parallel twins or singles, with only the Gold Star range using a different chassis. The B33's engine was a 499cc with a bore and stroke of 85 by 88. Compression was 6.8 to 1, and the whole thing made around 23 horsepower. Enough for the 4-speeder to manage a surprisingly smooth and civilised 82 miles an hour. And there's no doubt that the B33 and its B31 smaller sibling makes an excellent first classic. They're simple, easy to work on, pretty reliable, and parts availability is extremely good. And performance and handling are up to the best of pretty much all the machines around at that time. What other groups of bikes or single bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Perhaps you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.